Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Friday morning session of Media in Transition. I'm Matthew Gale. I'm Head of Displays at Tate Modern, and I'd like to start with a few thanks. Thank you in particular to all the contributors so far and to the artists who joined us yesterday and put their work up for discussion. But also to all of those who made the show and tell sessions possible, which have been an interesting characteristic of this conference, and I think will remain long in the memory. I had a few thoughts to help us into this last day, and while people are taking their seats, do come further forward, especially colleagues who I recognise. As Tom said yesterday, there are legacies. This is a legacy of many processes. Object in Transition was the conference that was held at the Getty in 2008. We had a conference here called Inherent Vice, which was dealing with the replication of modernist sculpture, and it had some overlaps and coincidences with some of the issues that we've discussed today. But one of the steering committee members coined a particular phrase which stayed with me after that event. It was in 2007, which was that he felt that he'd been inducted into the sect of the scrupulous. And I think that rather underlines why we're all here, and that's held in common with the very purpose of having a conference of this sort, that we're all scrutinizing and being extremely scrupulous about what we find in those different investigations, and trying very hard not to overstep the mark, not to make assumptions, and not to leap to conclusions. And I think that was pretty evident in the presentations that were given yesterday. As a result of that, I thought it might be useful just as a sort of aid memoir to the last couple of days, and partly because I've been writing lots of notes, just to pick out some of the terms that have come up slightly at random in the course of the last few days. And I'll just read through a list that I've culled from the notes that I've been making, which I hope will trigger back into the discussions that have been going on, and perhaps also be useful as we take those discussions forward today and over the days to come. So just a list of words and phrases. Absurdity, accidents and incidents, cherishing and flourishing, collaboration speeds innovation, dystopia, fetishization, friction, historical imagination, knot of anxiety. That seemed particularly resonant, especially in relation to loop. Melancholy, precarity, resistance of medium, simulation, surveillance, and usefulness of doubt. So some of those things came up in the issues raised yesterday, in the really interesting investigations into the ways in which we think about what was described as the DNA of the artwork, how that suggests growth and development, and the role that the artist continues to play in that relationship, and how artists sanction different things. In the conference that I just mentioned that we held here, one of our big conclusions, if anything becomes definitive, is how we signal what has happened, what you're showing to the audience, which made me particularly interested in the discussion of Jan Dibbert's yesterday and his refusal to see the work as being upgraded even when he had upgraded it, and what that tells us about how open we are as institutional people in showing that object to the public. I'm sure that will continue to be a cause for interest and investigation. And in particular, yesterday's session ended up with thinking about that public, I think. Barry drew attention to how perceptions of the object are changed by the experience held by the viewer. And so we need to think a little bit, perhaps quite a lot, about the expectations and the perceptions of the audience in relation to the works that we're thinking about from the material end as well. So a final thought from slightly a tangential area was really, I'd been thinking a little bit about Roman sculpture. And as you probably know, in the 19th century, Roman sculpture was seen as something that you sort of looked through to find Greek originals, so that multiple Roman sculptures led you back to Praxiteles or something like that. And it strikes me that that might be, if one inverted that equation, that might be something that we need to think about in relation to the multiple versions of different objects that are being thought about today, such as the different versions of Naumann's spinning spheres that we heard about yesterday. But there was a particular definition of that which struck me and perhaps chimes with some of those terms that I just read out that seems worth thinking about. The way in which that was theorized was called Coppian critique. And it was defined by someone perhaps rather critical of the term as a discourse of nostalgia for lost origins, sublimated as precise formalist description. Those terms seem to me to be things that we need to be aware of as we think of how we migrate and transfer objects, and in this particular case, time-based media objects. That's enough from me. I'm going to welcome Christine Frohnert to the podium. She is going to talk about things that are beyond our control, which may more or less summarize all of our concerns, but something more specific than that. Christine.
Good morning. Thank you to the organizers, to the Tate, and specifically to Pip Lawrenson, to the Getty Conservation Institute and the Getty Research Institute for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And thank you, Matthew, for the introduction. And yes, you are right. I'm going to focus on external dependencies that are beyond our control. And I first want to invite you into the late 60s to explore two very experimental artworks by the artist Earl Ryback. They are both owned by the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. So the works we are going to look at can actually be seen between the subjects of the two conferences. It's somehow anchored in the object in transition, but also in media in transition. So it's kind of a hybrid. Earl Ryback is probably not too well known on this side of the Atlantic. He was born in 1931 in New York City, and he held degrees in literature, in physics, and in nuclear engineering from MIT. So he very much came with this engineering background. And worked at MIT until 1965. He submitted numerous US patents, most of which at the very beginning had to do with his lifetime interest of luminar art, light-based works, many of which included motors that rotated light sources in light boxes, illuminating the behind. In a flyer, Ryback explained, having gone beyond just the technology of light and optics, I'm using it to convey a feeling of the mystery in time, space, light, energy, and our age that our age is exploring. And certainly, if you look at the imagery, there are some psychedelic references attached to it. Howard Weiss was a strong supporter of his work, and his work was shown in 3 one-man shows in 1965, 66, and 68, and in 4 group shows, and one of which was the landmark exhibition, TV as a Creative Medium, at his gallery in New York in 1969. As many of you know, this exhibition was the first exhibition in the United States that was entirely dedicated to television as an artistic medium. On a quote by, I'm quoting Ben Fortis from the EAI website, in retrospect, one might naturally underestimate the catalytic moment of TV as a creative medium, a 12-artist exhibition. TV as a creative medium signaled radical changes at both the aesthetic and popular levels. It inspired a generation of artists and non-artists to take up the medium that soon came to be known as video. The visionary Howard Weiss, which is shown here in the center with Charlotte Mormon, was a retired Midwestern executive and one of the most really interesting characters of the New York art scene in the 1960s. His gallery was primarily devoted to works made with a wide range of technological materials, and it's mostly remembered for its pioneering efforts in the field of video art. In Weiss' view, the works he showed humanized the technologies they utilized. Speaking of humanizing technologies, Charlotte Mormon was performing at the gallery with Namjoon Paik's TV bra for living sculpture in, that show in 1969, as you probably all very well know. Less known are Earl Ryback's contributions to this iconic exhibition, his 3 experiments with the TV tube that he carried out, interestingly, in collaboration with the New York City-based main CRT manufacturer at the time, RCA. So Ryback creates the 3 TV sets at a time where color TV was still a very, very young and fascinating technology to the artists. So let's have a look at thrust. Ryback's thrust documents really an innovative use of the television set without even using a video input from a playback device. Ryback modified the television set by scraping off the phosphor from the inside of the tube's front. He mounted a screen perpendicular in the tube, and then he painted the inside of the tube with phosphorus paint. And once the television was switched on, the electron beam sweeps and scans across the inner screen, shooting images in color that are produced in response to the broadcast signal that was picked up. As we all know, usually the inside of the tube is a vacuum, and Ryback was fascinated that he was able to collaborate with a manufacturer that, what we assume, who delivered parts to him, so he was able to work on the screen from the inside, to paint the tube from the inside, and then we assume it was delivered back to RCA because it's so professionally sealed and so professionally made that it's hard to believe that he had the machinery available in the studio. But still, this needs to be confirmed. Very, very little documentation is available from his estate, and very little documentation is actually available from RCA, and it needs more investigation. Interestingly enough, Ryback at the age of 12 already filed his first patent, and this was a visionary concept of a color TV. So this just shows his engagement early on, being emerging engineer, but it also shows his interest in modifying technologies and pushing them. In a way, by scraping off the screen of the CRT television, which I would consider being almost a public space, which is shown broadcast television, he went into this space to claim it as his own artistic space. So he really turned it into, well, his studio inside the tube once it picked up the analog signal. As we all know, the analog signal was discontinued in 2009 in the US. So this contemporary link to the artwork, this external dependency, is gone, and is the first example of artworks with external dependencies that are beyond our control. In addition, even a year before the analog signal wasn't available anymore, another problem was encountered as the work didn't power on anymore, and it was investigated, and as so often, a faulty flyback transformer was found that also compromised other components of the artwork. And given the age of the work, you can just imagine how hard it is to find replacement components. And luckily, it was possible to secure a service manual that the engineers could work from, but they had very little luck finding components. So it was really an act of reverse engineering, going through each circuit and identifying each loose or burned joint and resoldering it. So we want to give a lot of credit to the engineers who actually have worked with Pike in the past. So they are located in New York City as well. They have been trained in Taiwan in specifically CRT engineering. And those are our last source of knowledge and skill set within New York City for CRT repair. In preparation for the inaugural show at the Whitney Museum last spring, options were explored if and how the work can be shown, and if there are ways to just convert the digital signal to analog, which is actually not that ambitious. So by means of attaching a so-called leaf antenna and connecting it with a converter box with an analog pass-through, which were both implemented in the pedestal behind the piece, it was possible to run the work again, and so the viewer could experience it after quite a long time that it has been on view previously. So let's look at a very similar work, a suspension by Ryback, shown in the same exhibition. In suspension, a phosphor-coated grid is expanded within the tube. The grid also receives the analog broadcast signal, and while the back of the tube provides the colored phosphor illuminated by scattered electrons. The fact that these works were intended to use the contemporary broadcast signal connects the CRT technology with the current broadcast, but it also historically anchors the physical work and the time of the creation and connects at the same time with the contemporary technology and with the contemporary broadcast, and therefore provides a stunning actuality. I found another note in the curatorial questionnaire file saying that, quote Ryback, I employ contemporary technology to achieve a sense of wonder and mystery. So he was very much in favor of having a link to contemporary technology. Looking at the back of the CRTs in more detail, more things were discovered that were brought to our attention, like components that you usually don't find in a CRT, like this wooden handle here. This red component is it's a booster that was implemented to help the faulty flyback transformer. This is flyback transformer in this unit is still working, but it needs additional power to power up, and this is what the booster is implemented for. And as we have seen in both examples, the artworks have been compromised by changes in the external technological environment. And this is not the first case we have witnessed this in artworks. So I would like to just reference very, very quickly to two other artworks, one of which is a work that is dependent on the medium wave signal, which is Jean Tinguely's Radio Number 1 from 1960, a time when Jean Tinguely created a lot of radio works by basically deassembling medium wave receiver down to its components, and then he fitted them along with the loudspeaker. In this case, he fitted them on a carriage, and with other salvage parts, he attached them to a base, and there's a motor on the base, which is basically pushing the carriage back and forth, but also there's a motor here, which is connected to the tuning knob of the radio, which switches from station to station. And so while the radio is picking up the medium radio wave, so it's basically tuning in and out, in and out, in and out, creating this cacophony of an audio signal. So while the medium wave signal is not much available anymore, options were explored in the past how the work can be shown in the future. And we have discussed the idea of a relict yesterday, which is one option to show it as it is. It can still be shown in motion, but will not pick up the medium radio wave anymore, or possible streams from a digital audio file were also explored. I don't want to judge in one or the other direction. I just want to use this example to encourage discussion among those works with external dependencies and how we look at them in the future and how we document them today and how we plan for possible future retirement. Fast forward, let's move into 2013 by using another example by Jean-Baptiste Michel. This is an artwork that is entitled, I Wish I Could Be Exactly What You're Looking For. It is also owned by the Whitney Museum of American Art, and it basically consists of a Twitter API and an LCD screen on the upper right, a spray-painted mat board, and a glass front. And so it is exploring of what people wish for. So it is basically showing live tweets containing I wish that are displayed on the upper right on the LCD screen and are updated every few seconds. If which seems to be unlikely today, but if Twitter becomes unavailable someday, the work will also lose its important link to contemporary actuality. So this brings me back to the title, No Medium, No Message. And as Stuart Comer said yesterday, the container on which an artwork is delivered carries significance, and which even accumulates over time as we move away from that technology, or we move away from that medium. And fetishism was mentioned yesterday as well when it comes to dated technology. So what we have to do is we have to understand these works with all its dependencies, and maybe during its lifetime develop strategies how we can present it once the external dependency is not available anymore. Again, we have the option to just retire it, show it as a relic, disconnect it from this contemporary link, or we have the option to modify, to tweak, to emulate. The question is, should we? And I want to close with that. Thank you.
Let's try some questions now, I think. Has anyone got some questions for Christine? We've got a couple of minutes now before we move on to the next presentation. I think anything specific to this, and then we could wrap into other aspects of this once we have had the second presentation. Nobody moved? Oh, yes, okay. A late bid there. Do we have a...
Thank you. I was wondering if you had any ideas on that question that you left us with.
Well, that might not be a satisfying answer, but as so often, it might be a case-by-case basis. I find the decision of showing the Ryback with the digital to analog converter less painful as imagine to record some tweets and show a record that doesn't have that contemporary link anymore with the work once Twitter is not available anymore. With the Tengeli, I might tend towards this direction as well, because if this is run from an audio file that was recorded in 2005, even though it is not audible, so because it's the tuner spinning around all the time, so you just hear this cacophony, it still doesn't quite seem right. With the Ryback, since he also expressed that he was interested in this link of contemporary broadcast, again, I feel less of a pain to make that happen, but this is just me, and the reason I chose this subject is that I'm fascinated with this, and I feel a need to discuss this with a wider audience, because I also see that some people have strong feelings about it, and I understand why. So I just see that we as a profession now reaching an interesting time to move further into the discussion, as we will be confronted with it more and more in the future, and it shouldn't hit us by accident. So I'm just exploring ways of getting prepared.
There's another one in the... Okay.
Thank you, Christine. That was really great. I just wonder, to some extent, it seems to be a display decisions that are not unlike the ones that are made in ethnographic or presentation of ethnographic or archaeological collections, because once the actuality of the work is severe through the technology being obsolete or whatever, the radio no longer existing, or the Twitter. In a way, it's either you present the work as a ruin, a relic, like we said, or you give an idea of what was its functionality, even though it's not its functionality. So it's like, I don't know, I see it as, do you display, Native American arrows as beautiful objects behind a showcase, or do you make a whole display where you have fake people using them and showing how they were used?
I mean, it's always an option, of course, to have the work being shown as a static display, as a relic, and then have a video with it, showing it functioning. But the video needs to be created while the external dependency was still there, in order to make it work. Does this answer your question at all?
Well, I just wonder if there's also, it's like an educational choice too. Imagine like the way in the future, wherever people might not have any idea of what was Twitter. Do you want to show them this work just static? This is a piece that once existed, or do you want to show how it would have worked and try to give people to understand what would have been its meaning at the time?
Certainly an option to explore, yeah.
Can we take one more question, then we'll draw other questions in once we have the next presentation. Glenn had a question there.
I think the Ryback piece really becomes an instrument in a way that can function no matter what the signal is. I mean, it would function if there were static to a sense, but I'm not so sure that it's a piece that's about broadcast so much as broadcast was the most convenient way to get a signal, whereas a work like the Twitter piece is more of a vessel. And that link, to the present moment becomes so crucial that I agree with you. If you were to just kind of can some old tweets and put in the piece, then what's the point? Whereas the Ryback, you could put almost anything, and as an instrument, it would still function.
Yeah, I agree.
Very good, thank you. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Christine. Thank you very much. We're going to, yes, indeed.